Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out this morning. Today, I'm going to talk about wildlife habitat and also the issues with biodiversity and renewable energy. So first, does anybody know what these are? This is the European mantis. What do we know about the European mantis? It is a predator. It's a voracious predator. It's our state insect. The European mantis is our state insect. It's a voracious predator. It's actually destructive. So should it be our state insect? We actually might be nominating a new state insect, a more appropriate one that's not so destructive. But a lot of people think that the mantis, the praying mantis, we have two, the Chinese mantis and the European mantis. And a lot of people think that they're protected. They're actually not protected. It's just that they were declared a state insect. Hopefully we'll have a new insect soon. But afterwards you can come up and take a look at them if you like. So I'm going to talk about starting with wildlife habitat. So is this good wildlife habitat? So what do you think? Is this good wildlife habitat? It is not? Okay. Okay. Why is it not good habitat? So barren, one kind of plant. Okay. Does everyone agree? Yeah. What if you're a prairie warbler? Do you think this will be good habitat for a prairie warbler? They like pine barren habitat. So we have some short, thick pines. We have some exposed ground, looks like a pine barren. It's actually excellent habitat for a prairie warbler. And field sparrows like this kind of habitat, kingbirds, willow flycatchers, kestrels, bluebirds, brown thrasher, a species of special concern in Connecticut. Box turtles will come out into a habitat like this to lay their eggs. Tiger beetles need that exposed sandy soil to dig their burrows. This is actually excellent habitat if you're one of these species. So there's different kinds of habitats, and each species needs its own kind of habitat. What about that? Is that good habitat? Definitely not. Gulls might like it. Maybe crows, maybe bears, but even for them, this is not good habitat. What happens to a landfill when you can't fit any more trash in it? Do you know what happens after? Yes, Sue.
Gets capped
It gets capped with what?
with soil.
Mm-hmm. And then
Planted with grass.
grass, and then grasses and wildflowers can grow. So now is a good habitat? If you were an ant, well, we're all animals, but if you were a native wildlife, you probably wouldn't want to build a home and drill a well in here. We don't know what was in that trash. So we don't know if the soil or the groundwater is contaminated. But for the animals living on the surface, if you have a large capped landfill with all these grasses and wildflowers growing, that is excellent habitat for bobolink. When's the last time you saw a bobolink? Has anyone even heard of a bobolink? Most people haven't. But this is one of our native birds. It's one of our native grassland ground nesting birds. These birds nest right on the ground. So as the grass grows up, they build their nest on the ground in these grasses, and they hide in the cover of the grasses and also in the cover of all of that space. It's hard to find them. What about meadowlarks? Have you ever heard of meadowlarks? This is another one of our grassland ground nesting birds. Other ones you probably haven't heard of: grasshopper sparrow, upland sandpiper, the bobolink, and the meadowlark are species of special concern in Connecticut because their populations have plummeted. The grasshopper sparrow and the upland sandpiper are endangered in Connecticut. These birds need grasslands of about 100 acres or more. When's the last time you saw a 100-acre grassland in Connecticut? So why do you think these birds are so rare? They don't have their habitat. But it's not just these ground nesting birds. Butterflies can use this. So when the wildflowers start to grow, there's some nectar sources. Some of our butterflies have caterpillars that feed on grasses. Again, more pollinators, bees, yes.
What are native types of wild grass feed?
Oh, too many to get into. Some of the common native grasses, so we have native cool season grasses and native warm season grasses. So for large native grasslands, which typically would grow on dry sandy soils, some of those grasses would be little blue stem, broom sedge, big blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, some wild rye, deer tongue, different species of deer tongue, but there's actually a lot of grasses. So a lot of different native grasses would grow on a native grassland. So an interesting side note, all of our native grassland grasses, so the grasses that grew in these dry sandy soils, those are all warm season grasses. Our native cool season grasses are grasses that grow in open woodlands or in wetlands or wet meadow areas. But a lot of species, so people tend not to think about grass, but actually many of our grasses are very important for wildlife. Our native grasses also tend to have very deep roots, and so they're very hardy and they're very good at stabilizing soil and for surviving in times of drought because the roots are so deep. Also, again, box turtles will come out into this habitat from woodland edges, dig a hole to make their nest. So they have to have some soil where they can dig into to lay their eggs. So a lot of these species people haven't heard of. They're not common, they don't see them. But I bet everybody's familiar with this one. What's this one? Why does everybody know about white-tailed deer? Because we have a lot of them. You're probably going to see them. What?
I said, holy cow.
Holy- yeah.
Hold on.
We have a very high deer density in Connecticut. So why do we have so many deer? Well, lack of predators is one. So now I think the biggest predator is vehicles. Also hunters, but we don't have those native wild predators that we used to. So wolves and mountain lions, they've been gone for a long time. But there's another reason why there's so many of them. What kind of habitat do deer like? Woodlands, they do very well in small woodlands, which we have a lot of. Older, middle-aged woodlands, old woodlands, young woodlands, swamps. What else? What else do we have a lot of? Yeah, they'll come into your backyards. So even if you don't see deer, you might see evidence of deer, especially if you have a vegetable or a flower garden or some tasty ornamental shrubs. Yeah, so it's said that deer prefer to eat a few things, but they will eat just about everything. So there is a lot of food for them. But that's not the case with many others, like this critter. Who knows what this is? Who wants to guess?
In general.
Yes. So this is the caterpillar of the monarch butterfly. And what does the caterpillar of the monarch butterfly eat? Milkweed, yes. What else does it eat? It's a trick question. They don't eat anything else, just milkweed. What would happen if we didn't have any milkweed? We wouldn't have any monarchs. So monarch butterflies, their populations have been going down drastically. In fact, we have the new statistics in, and this past winter was a pretty bad year for them. So you can see how this population has been going down, down, down. So here's an important wildlife concept. For a species to exist, the individuals have to be able to complete their life cycle. So that adult butterfly has to survive, has to find food, which is nectar, be able to find some milkweed to lay the egg. The egg has to hatch into the caterpillar, and it has to have enough milkweed to feed on so that it can grow to a mature caterpillar, form its chrysalis, find some shelter to form its chrysalis, and then emerge as the adult butterfly. But remember, that adult butterfly has to continue that cycle. So the individuals have to be able to survive and successfully reproduce. And so what is it that the monarch caterpillars need as part of their life cycle is the milkweed. Where does milkweed grow? What kind of habitat does milkweed grow in? Does it grow in the forest? No. It grows in open habitats, meadows, grasslands, old fields. So milkweed is a native plant. There's actually a few native species of milkweed. A few of them are the common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, swamp milkweed, to name a few. But these native milkweeds grow in these open habitats. And so we need these open habitats to support species like the monarch butterfly caterpillar, as well as many other ones, because it's not just the monarch butterfly populations that are declining, but as a group, butterflies are declining. They've been showing this declining trend over the years. And insects as a whole have been declining drastically. In fact, to the point where this has made headlines. And as National Geographic tells us, we'll miss them when they're gone because insects perform so many important ecosystem services. We know about pollination. They're also the cleanup crew, decomposers, seed dispersers, some of them, and a major part of the wildlife food web. So not to get too down, but worldwide, the average wildlife population has declined by about 70%. Closer to home, this was in the news again not too long ago. In the last 50 years in the United States and Canada, we've lost nearly 3 billion birds, so 3 billion individual birds that used to fill the skies over the United States and Canada. That's nearly a third. So nearly a third of all the individual birds are no longer there. And the thing with this trend, so if we've lost nearly a third of our birds in the past 50 years, the way the trends work, you keep going down, eventually you'll hit zero. And for wildlife populations, you get to a point and then they just fall off a cliff. So we need to stop this trend before it gets to that point. So we don't need to just throw up our hands and say, oh, this is too big. Every person can do a little thing that will help. One of the things you can do to help is to grow native plants in your yard. The more native plants you have, the better it will be for the health of the ecosystem. So if we want to reverse these trends, the first thing we need to do is to know about what all of these different species need. So there's some basic ones. All animals have 4 basic needs. There are 4 basic biological requirements that their habitat supplies them with. So what are those 4 basic requirements? Things that we need as well. Shelter is one. Food, yep. Food. And what else? Yes? What? Yep. Food, water, shelter. What's the 4th thing? I actually touched on this. What was it? Space. Yeah. So all animals have to have enough space so they can find all of the food, water, and shelter that they need to survive and to successfully reproduce. But as Doug Tallamy tells us, and if you're not familiar with Doug Tallamy, I highly recommend this book, Bringing Nature Home. He gets into a lot of detail about the importance of native plants for our wildlife populations. He has Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hopes. That's Doug Tallamy. But he tells us so far we have not shared space very well with our fellow earthlings. But as I said, there are things we can do. And when I first heard this statistic, in the next 50 or 100 years, we could lose half the species that were here when the settlers first arrived. At first, I thought, no way, that can't be possible. Then when I started looking at the trends, I thought, that is possible. But we can stop this. We can do something about this. So all species, as I said before, they have to have their type of habitat. So each species has a different type of habitat that it needs. So we already looked at prairie warbler, pine barrens, old field with scattered pines. This, you can see the wildflower meadow in the front, but with some scattered trees and shrubs in the back, sort of an old field type habitat. So great habitat for a lot of our species. So they have to have enough area, enough space so they can get all of their requirements. And those areas have to be suitable. Kind of hard to see that. So remember, we need suitable places for all critters to exist. They need to have their space. Now, we talked about some of those grassland birds before. Does anyone remember the names of those grassland birds? Bobolink was one of them. Grasshopper sparrow, yes. Yep, the upland sandpiper. Yep, and yeah, the meadowlark. Yeah. All right, so those species used to be found at the airfield at Rensselaer Field. So we're looking down from above, a huge grassland area. Well, then it started to get chipped away. Okay, maybe there's still enough for those birds. Is there any space for them now? Right, so what happens to these birds when their habitat disappears? What happens to any animal when its habitat disappears? Right, you either have to find another one, and they're not usually making any more habitat. They're not making any more land, or they won't survive. So another important concept, the number one threat to wildlife is loss of habitat. That is the number one threat in general to wildlife. Now, if you're a little brown bat, your number one threat might be white nose syndrome. But in general, the number one threat worldwide for wildlife is loss of habitat. So let's take a look at this habitat again. So this was a capped landfill. And this was another headline in the news a few years ago. So that landfill was owned by the town. And of course, the town wanted to develop renewable energy. And who wouldn't? We need renewable energy. Well, it did, in fact, evict those grasshopper sparrows. So when you fill a grassland habitat with solar arrays, these are choices you have to make. Are you going to do renewable energy? Are you going to have wildlife habitat? Can you put this renewable somewhere where it isn't impacting threatened and endangered species? So as you can see, this isn't very good habitat. It's good to do renewable energy, but where are we going to put this renewable energy infrastructure? So in Connecticut, I had trouble finding up-to-date numbers of acres in Connecticut for renewable energy, but hundreds of farmland and hundreds of acres of woodlands as well. More recent ones, nearly 500 acres is being developed for a solar array in East Windsor, another couple hundred acres in Litchfield, Torrington. So these are choices that you're all going to have to make when you're, well, in your scenario, when you're choosing where are you going to develop housing, where are you going to develop renewable energy. These are things that you need to think about. Yes.
It's been since 1950, we've lost over 1 million acres of farmland in Connecticut.
Oh.
Yet we're still developing.
And we're still developing it, yeah. So what little is left. So it was estimated, so the Connecticut Farmland Trust and other organizations are protecting some farmland. So about the number of acres of farmland that were protected, about half that number has been developed for solar. Now, another thing to think about is when they develop these solar arrays, normally they're leased for about 25 years. And think of this too, it's hard work being a farmer. What if someone approaches a farmer and says, I'll lease your land for this much money and you have this guaranteed income? What would you do? So if you're a farmer, this is your private land, you know, this is a choice that they're making. For a town, a municipality, maybe they can make different decisions. So as we mentioned,
So solar.
oh, yes.
Solar installations are considered agriculture, like you can.
Well, oh, so
use them?
these agricultural fields are easy to put these solar arrays on. And so that's why they're targeted for the solar infrastructure. It's easier than, you know, a hillside or a small, you can put all of these solar arrays close together. So our woodlands are being impacted, our farmland is being impacted. Of grasslands are being impacted. So when you hear about a landfill, well, this is another thing about the landfill. People say, oh, you want to keep it out of the landfill. What would that landfill be if it wasn't a landfill? Would it have been houses? Would it have been developed? So if it's a landfill and then it's capped, well, now it's habitat. But then if you put the solar arrays on it, then it's not habitat. You're producing renewable energy, which we need to do, but it's not habitat. So these are all just things that we need to think about as we move forward. We need renewable energy, but we need to do it right. We need to do it the best way that we can. So another recent woodland proposal is about 75 acres in Waterford. So you can see as we're chipping away, the more habitat we take away, the fewer or the lower the wildlife populations will be. So we just looked at a few different types of habitat. We looked at grassland, oilfield, woodland. So let's talk about that process of how these habitats change, because a habitat isn't necessarily going to stay at that stage. So let's talk about succession. Those grasslands, old fields, wildflower meadows, those are referred to as early successional habitats. They occur early in that stage of forest succession. So the important thing to think about is each stage in that process of succession is important for different types of wildlife. So if you go way back to the very beginning of succession, that would be bare ground, and that could happen after a flood or a fire or a glacier retreating. But that is good habitat for killdeer. They lay their eggs right on the bare soil. The eggs are camouflaged. They blend in with the soil. So that's how those eggs hide. Remember, we saw those tiger beetles earlier. Many of our native bees burrow in the ground in that exposed soil. So that is nesting habitat. Remember, we can provide nectar for our bees, but if they can't reproduce, if they can't complete their life cycle, then the species won't exist. So we need to provide nesting sites for bees as well. But eventually grasses and wildflowers will start to grow. Now that's good habitat for our friend the bobolink, if it's big enough. So bobolink need at least 10 acres of grassland. Those grasshopper sparrows need about 100 acres of grassland. Bluebirds, which more people are familiar with, can survive in smaller patches of grassland. And that's why we're more familiar with bluebirds. There's more of them because they can survive in smaller patches of habitat. Those species that depend on larger patches of habitat are more vulnerable. So eventually scattered shrubs and tree seedlings start to pop up. Now it's old field habitat. That's good habitat for the blue-winged warbler, the kingbird that we were talking about, kestrels, field sparrows. And as those shrubs and tree seedlings fill in, making a thick shrubland habitat, now it's good habitat for that brown thrasher, species of special concern in Connecticut. The brown thrasher is disappearing because our shrublands are disappearing. As those tree seedlings continue to grow into a young forest, that's good habitat for ruffed grouse, for woodcock, for chestnut-sided warblers, for towhees. And then as it grows into the mature forest, then it's good habitat for many of our more familiar species. Well, scarlet tanager for one, but also our black-capped chickadees, the tufted titmice, the white-breasted nuthatches. So most of our undeveloped land in Connecticut now is mature forest, and that's why we're more familiar with those mature forest species, white-tailed deer. So these are the habitats that occur early in that stage of succession, and those are the habitats we refer to as early successional habitats. So again, if we want all of our native species, we have to have suitable habitats. So suitable places for all critters to exist. Now, some species depend on multiple stages of habitat. The woodcock, for example, will do their breeding display in these open habitats, so open fields or meadows or grasslands, but they need that thick, young, deciduous forest to make their nests. And even forest interior birds depend on forest openings where there's grasses and wildflowers growing, where they find a lot of insects that they need to feed to their young. So if somebody were to tell you, oh, it's just an empty field, you would know better. you would know that that field would be full of life. Grassland ground nesting birds, butterflies, bees, box turtles, meadow jumping mice, kestrels. But if we leave that field alone, so our native grasslands were typically in dry, sandy soil. It was difficult for the trees to grow in these areas. And they are also more susceptible to fires. A grassland like this, eventually over time, it's going to go through that process of succession. It's going to start growing shrubs and tree seedlings. And someone might look at this and say, oh, that's overgrown with shrubs and little trees. Well, it's not overgrown, it's habitat. Look at all those places that shrubland birds could hide their nests. Remember, they have to be able to hide their nests, because if they can't hide their nests, then they won't be able to complete their life cycle. So this is an important habitat. Now, when the settlers first arrived, they did encounter vast tracts of mature forest. And what did they do to that forest? They cut it down. All right, how is this for forest species? Not good, no. How is this for grassland species? It was very good. And in fact, back in the day when agriculture moved at a much slower pace, these grassland ground nesting birds were able to nest in those hayfields and pastures, and most of them raised their young before the scythe came along, before they got trampled by the sheep. But what happened when people started abandoning their farms for the cities or for the richer soils of the Midwest? What happened? Let it go, and then what happened to the land? Eventually grew back into forest, and it went through these stages. So succession happened. So at first, these little shrubs and tree seedlings started popping up here and there. So it's not distinct stages. It's actually more like a continuum. So as these grassland patches got smaller and smaller, first you would lose the species like upland sandpipers and grasshopper sparrows, because they needed big grasslands. And as more and more of that grassland disappeared, more and more of those grassland species would disappear. But your old field species would start to show up, your blue-winged warbler, your field sparrow, your kingbirds. And then as it started to grow into more thick shrubland habitat, now you have more of your shrubland birds, your golden-winged warblers, your catbirds, your brown thrasher. But yes, eventually it started growing up. Here's some young forest. Again, woodcock, ruffed grouse, towhees, they love that young forest. But today, as I said, most of the undeveloped land in Connecticut is mature and mostly mature deciduous forest. But when you go for a walk in the woods and you see these stone walls, that's a sign of our agricultural past. Think about the stages that that forest went through before it became this mature forest, and think about the species that used to be there, but they're not there now. So if Connecticut is just growing back into the forest that it wants to be, why do we need to be concerned about those early stage habitats and the species that depend on them? Want to guess? Do we need to be concerned about them? Yes.
Well, because we used to have so much open land. Now there isn't.
We used to have so much open land. Yes, we always had those habitats. In fact, it's estimated that we have less grassland now than we did before the settlers arrived. So if the forest is always trying to grow back, and think also about how is the forest able to grow back? But if it's always trying to grow back, how is it that we had those other habitats? Anyone want to guess? Mentioned it a little bit earlier. Yes. Yeah, fire. Fire was a frequent occurrence on the landscape. Fire is why we have fire-dependent species like pitch pine. These species evolved with fire. So pitch pine needs that fire to burn off the leaf litter and open up the cones. Those seeds need exposed soil in order to germinate. Fire was a frequent occurrence on the landscape. So we have fire-dependent and other disturbance-dependent species. What happens now when a fire breaks out? We stop it, we put it out. So this does not bode well for fire-dependent species and other disturbance-dependent species. But it wasn't just fires that were at work on the landscape. What else was at work on the landscape? That's a clue. What?
Floods.
Floods. And there was also something that actually caused floods. An animal. Beavers, yes. Because what do beavers do? Well, they cut down trees. So beavers can cut down a lot of trees. So just by cutting down those trees, they're creating these openings. And think back about 12,000 years ago when we had giant beavers. Here's a comparison of today's American beaver with the former giant beaver. You can imagine all the work that these critters were capable of. But it wasn't just giant beavers. We had other large mammals like mammoths. These were grazers, so they roamed the grasslands of New England. And we also had mastodons. These were browsers. So as the forest started to grow after the glacier retreated, they would nibble down all of those trees coming up. They could push them down, eat the leaves, the buds. But obviously they could eat a lot of trees, right? So they'd eat them and then move on. And then that area would start to grow back. Our native plants evolved with these natural disturbances, and that's how the forest is able to grow back, because it evolved having to grow back after these disturbances. Now, we know that these went extinct about 10,000 years ago, but we know about 12,000 years ago, humans were in Connecticut. Humans cut down trees. They used fire extensively. So they were helping to shape the landscape. They also grew crops. So they would clear an area, grow their crops for a few years, and then move to a different area, let the soil recover, and then that area would go back through its stages. Now the beavers, when they cut down their trees, and what do they do with parts of the tree? Parts of the tree they use for food, but other parts they use for building dams. Yep. Depending where they build their dam, they can actually flood very large areas. And what happens to those trees that are still standing, but now they're flooded? What's going to happen to them? They're permanently flooded now. Do you think they can survive that? No. So they start to die off. So imagine this used to be a forest. It got flooded. Those trees were killed. Now it's excellent habitat. This is great habitat if you're a duck or a fish or a turtle or a frog or a kingfisher, great blue heron. So we call beavers a keystone species because they are very influential in shaping the landscape and providing habitat for certain species. I like to refer to beavers as our original wildlife habitat managers. But eventually the beavers are going to eat themselves out of house and home, and they're going to have to move on and find another spot. And what happens to that pond? What? I hear some whispering. What's going to happen to the pond if the beaver aren't there to repair the dam all the time? It's going to revert back. Yeah, so the dam is going to start to leak. That pond will drain. The stream will find its course again. That sediment will be exposed. Plants will start to grow on it, and it will go through those stages. If you've ever heard the term beaver meadow, that's what this refers to, an abandoned beaver pond that is now reverting back. Some towns have a beaver meadow road, and that's what this refers to. The road at some point went past an abandoned beaver pond that has reverted into a meadow. And this is great habitat for bees and butterflies, red-winged blackbirds, bluebirds. But what's eventually going to happen to it? Yeah, old fields, shrubland, young forest, mature forest. And at that point, the beavers can move back in and start the process all over again. So it's this cycle. So we had fires, wildfires, fires by Native Americans, beavers. And there are also some weather events that can cause these early successional habitat, pushing back the clock: tornadoes, ice storms, hurricanes, windstorms, seasonal or weather-related flooding. So at any point in time across the landscape, so looking down on the land, you could have a current beaver pond, a beaver meadow where they abandoned it years ago, a recent forest fire where there was a fire 10 years ago and it's reverting. So the animals would have to move around, sort of shift their areas in order to maintain their habitat. As their habitat got too old for them, they'd have to find it somewhere else. So you may have learned about the New England Cottontail. Has anyone heard of the New England Cottontail? Okay, so the New England Cottontail has lost more than 80% of its original range. So where do you think the historic range of the New England Cottontail was? Yes. New England, yes, and a little bit of New York as well. Now, the New England Cottontail depends on big areas of thick shrubby habitat. What does that tell you about the landscape of New England? Yeah, we used to have enough thick shrubby habitat to maintain viable populations of New England Cottontails and other shrubland species like the brown thrasher and the golden winged warbler. So we don't let fires burn, and we don't let beavers do the work they're capable of. We still have a lot of beavers in Connecticut, but we don't let them do the work they're capable of. We fence off trees, we put in water level control structures or break down the dams. So if we don't let those processes happen, how are we going to keep these critters on the landscape? How are we going to provide habitat for them? Anyone want to guess? We can. We can go in there and cut down those trees. Now, we hear a lot in the news about the Amazon rainforest, the destruction of the rainforest, the old growth forest, and the temperate rainforest. So the Amazon rainforest and the temperate rainforest, they did not evolve with the natural disturbances that our eastern forests did. And yes, they are cutting down massive amounts, and that is bad. However, in our area, if we cut down an area and let it grow back, and that's the important thing, we cut it down so we're simulating a natural disturbance and then we step back, let it go through the process and give those animals the space that they need to survive and to reproduce. And look out in the field, what was left out there? What is that?
The tree.
Yes, yes. So it's a big old dead tree. So our policy is leave all standing dead trees if safe to do so, because they are very important wildlife habitat elements. Food for insects, homes for woodpeckers and other birds and other critters. And then as the tree finally falls over after many years and it forms a log, that's also good habitat. Salamanders, some toads, some snakes, insects, other invertebrates. So here's an area where just 1 year after the cut, just 1 year after that, look at all the tree seedlings that are coming in. There were shrubs, blackberries, raspberries, tree sprouts, grasses, wildflowers, sedges, and birds that had not been there before. Birds that we consider species of greatest conservation need. So these aren't listed species, but these are species that their populations have been declining, and we need to stop the trend before they become listed species. So we had towhees there, blue-winged warblers, catbirds, indigo buntings, there were yellowthroats, yellow warblers, there were chestnut-sided warblers here, Baltimore orioles, rose-breasted grosbeaks. So species whose populations were declining, plus wider diversity and a bigger abundance of species by making this cut. So we just said that it's not good to cut down forests. Well, it's not good for wildlife to cut down forests and put solar panels in, but we're cutting down some forest here. Should we be doing that? We should. I totally agree. So the difference is we're letting the forest grow back. So there's still habitat for wildlife. But what about climate change?
Not the metal one that they sequester carbon. high efficiency rates comparable to that of normal forests.
Yes, so they're actually taking in, at this stage, it's not actually taking in a lot of carbon. But the first thing is we need our biodiversity. So if we leave the carbon stored there, then we're not helping biodiversity. And biodiversity is profoundly important to the health, not only of wildlife, but to us as well. But to your point, let's take a look at the carbon clock. So this outer ring, that brown, that's carbon storage. So the darker the brown, the more is stored. So around the clock, young forest to very old forest. So which forests store more carbon? Old growth. Now this green circle just inside is carbon capture. So there's two issues. There's storing the carbon and there's taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So where is it the darkest green? What,
Small sawtooth.
yeah, darkest green, actually going back to, yeah, so starting at about 5-inch diameter. So you can see about 18 years of age. So about an 18-year-old forest is now taking out more carbon from the atmosphere than an old forest is. It's growing fast, so it's taking a lot of carbon out. As that forest grows older, it's taking out less carbon. Now, you might hear that, well, old trees can take out more carbon than young trees. Sure, if those old trees have all the room to grow. But our forests don't look like this. Our forests look like this. And in fact, many of our forests are so crowded that they're barely growing. They're struggling. They have a few leaves at the top. They're struggling. They're not growing very much. Some of them are dying and falling over. So when they do that, some of that carbon is released. Some of it will get sequestered into the soil. Here is one such forest. So trees aren't growing much. All of the leaves are way at the top. A lot of the trees are falling over. So this forest really isn't capturing very much carbon. And look at the ground. If you're a wood thrush or an ovenbird and you need to hide your nest, you think you're going to be able to hide right there? What's going to happen if they try to put their nest right there? Yeah, somebody's going to find the nest and eat the young. So they wouldn't be able to complete their life cycle. So we talked about cutting down an area to make young forest, but we can also create openings in a mature forest and create some of that understory. So you can see here all of these little seedlings and ferns, and there's some grasses and sedges and wildflowers in there as well. You think an ovenbird or wood thrush could hide its nest in there, rose-breasted grosbeak could hide its nest in there. Places to hide. They need to be able to hide. They need that cover. So I talked about the different stages over time, but there's also different layers of the forest. So different species depend on these different stages, and different species also depend on the different layers of the forest. So we actually have quite a few ground nesting birds. We talked about grassland ground nesting birds, but there are also woodland ground nesting birds. Wood thrush, veery, hermit thrush, ovenbird, black and white warbler, turkey, woodcock, ruffed grouse. So let's get into a little bit more about if you're going to manage that forest. And Pete, are you monitoring my time?
8:35, so you have 10 minutes.
Okay, yes, a question.
What's the layer of her earth there?
Oh,
Ground.
ground layer. Yeah, so again, you could, if you have an exposed area in the forest where there's some opening, you get some of our native bumblebees nesting in that exposed ground layer. And again, that exposed ground layer, that's where pitch pine seedlings could germinate. So if you decide you have one of these overcrowded forests and you want to do some cutting, what's the first thing you want to think of? The first thing you might want to, or might need to do. And you might have learned this in your forestry workshop. What else might be in there besides those native? Invasives, yes. Have you learned about Japanese barberry? So this is a common forest understory invasive. So we need to get rid of that. Who's ever had to deal with bittersweet? Yeah, it's everywhere. But why is it so important to get rid of these non-native invasive plants? Yes. They take over. So you're reducing diversity because let's say you had an area that had 100 different species of native plants, and then this one non-native invasive takes over. Now you have one species, but it gets even worse than that. Take a look at the leaves of this bittersweet. So this is a non-native invasive bittersweet. Take a look at the leaves of one of our native plants, the black cherry. What do you notice about those leaves? Yes, they've been eaten. This is food. This is not. So when you take away all those native plants, you're also taking away all of the food for those insects that eat those native plants. In fact, about 90% of the insects that eat plants depend on plants that they evolved with. And that's why most of our native plant-feeding insects can only feed on native plants. And you know how the food chain works. So a caterpillar will eat the plant, a songbird will eat the caterpillar, maybe a hawk will eat the songbird. But it is a little more complex than that. It's more like a food pyramid. So you're probably familiar with the food pyramid. This is the wildlife food pyramid. And plants make up the base of that pyramid. And it's insects that are responsible more than any other group of animals for converting the energy from that plant base to higher levels of this food pyramid. So if we lost our native plant base, what would happen to this entire food pyramid? Yeah, it could just collapse. And as the famous biologist Edward Wilson tells us, insects are the little things that run the world. We need insects. And what is it that nearly all of our terrestrial birds feed to their young? Insects. Yes. Even the birds that you see at your seed feeder are raising their young on insects, and caterpillars are especially important. So Edward Wilson looked into what might happen if we lost insects. So we need pollinators. They're not just pollinating our crops, but they're pollinating all of those wildflowers that are out there that are feeding other pollinators, that are holding down the soil, that are keeping the waterways clean. It would change the physical structure of the habitat. It would eliminate the food for most of our wildlife, whether that's wildlife that eats the insects or eats the things that eat the things that eat the insects. The biosphere would rot because we wouldn't have our decomposers and our cleanup crew. We'd be doomed. But again, we can change this. We can grow native plants right in your yard, right in our yards. Even if you have a small yard, you can help by growing native plants. Now, some people are bringing up southern plants and planting them up here, thinking that those will be more adapted for our warmer climate. That's actually not the best thing to do. The best thing to do is to grow an abundance of wild, local, native plants. So the more abundant these plants are, the more genetic diversity they'll have, the better they'll be able to adapt to a changing climate. So the best thing to do is grow wild type, locally sourced native plants. That's the best thing we can do in the face of climate change. There are other problems that could come with transporting plants from other areas, diseases, they could become invasive. So, do I still have time, Pete? Oh, another 5 minutes. Excellent. Okay. Do we have time to go outside? Okay. All right. Well, when you go outside, if you don't have this app, I highly recommend that you download this app. This was developed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's the Merlin app. And it used to be you'd be able to put in some, answer some questions, and it would give you some suggestions about what bird it is you're looking at. Well, now it has sound ID. So you open up this app, just hold it up, and it will identify the birds that it hears. How did we know that there were grasshopper sparrows at that Cap landfill? They're not easy to see. They're hiding in the grass, but we can hear them. When we go out and do our bird surveys, Most of it is by ear, because those birds don't want to be seen. So if you want to assess a property, or even if you're going for a walk in the woods, you just want to know who's out there with you, I highly recommend the Merlin app. And for identifying other things, plants, insects, I recommend the Seek app. This one was developed by iNaturalist. So you don't even have to snap the picture with this one. You just hold it up to your plant or your insect, and it will tell you what it is if it has enough information. And if you take the picture, then it will give you information about that species. It will log your observations, keep track of your observations. And when you take the picture, you can actually upload your observation to inaturalist.org. So that's sort of keeping track of all living things on Earth. So the Seek app will identify just about any living thing if you can get close enough to it and if it has enough information. Now, what if you find a plant, but you want to know if it's native? So this is a great website to go to. It's called Go Botany, and this was developed by the Native Plant Trust. So they're trying to keep all of our native plants on the landscape. But if you put your plant name, and I recommend you put the Latin plant name, because common names tend to change. And it will show you on the map if it occurs in the area, if it's native to the area, or if it's not native to the area. And to end on a more positive note, I mentioned all of the species, the populations are declining or plummeting drastically. The one group that is a success story is waterfowl. And that's because we made a concerted effort to do something about the loss of waterfowl. Has anyone ever bought a duck stamp? Okay, yeah. So if you want to hunt waterfowl, you need to purchase a duck stamp. The money from that duck stamp purchase goes to the protection and restoration of wetlands, because the waterfowl need the wetlands. If we protect and restore the habitats, then we can keep these species on the landscape. You don't have to be a waterfowl hunter to purchase a duck stamp. Anyone can purchase a duck stamp. So we can do it if we try. So I think I'm out of time. Does anybody have questions?